Welcome to the warmth of our cabin fireplace, where shadows dance on wooden walls and the crackling flames invite us to share stories that chill the soul. I'm your host tonight, and if you're settling in with a warm drink on this cold evening, you've found exactly where you belong. You know that feeling when winter wind howls outside your window and you're grateful to be inside somewhere safe and warm. Well, tonight we're going to explore what happens when that safety becomes an illusion, when the veriest fears, because there's something about old places we seek comfort, become the source of our deep cabins, isolated houses and remote locations that seems to attract things that shouldn't exist. What I'm about to share with you are true accounts from people who thought they'd found the perfect retreat from the world, only to discover they weren't alone. These aren't Hollywood fabrications or urban legends passed down through generations. These are real experiences from real people who were brave enough to share their encounters with the unknown. Over the next hour, I'll be taking you through 5 absolutely chilling stories that will make you think twice about that cozy cabin rental you've been considering. We'll explore a family's terrifying weekend at a mountain lodge where something in the walls wouldn't let them sleep. You'll hear about a group of friends who discovered their lakeside cabin had a previous occupant who never really left. And I'll share the account of a writer who sought solitude to finish his novel, only to find himself sharing his workspace with an entity that had very different plans for his story. But before we dive into these bone-chilling tales, let me set something straight. I've been collecting and researching paranormal encounters for over 15 years. I've spoken with hundreds of witnesses, investigated dozens of locations, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that what you're about to hear will challenge. They're about the thin veil between our world and whatever lies beyond it. They're about the moments when that everything you think you know about the places we call home. These veiled tears, when the impossible becomes unstories, aren't just about ghosts or spirits deniably real. And when ordinary people find themselves face to face with forces that defy explanation. Now I want you to imagine you're right here with me in this cabin. Feel the warmth of the fire on your face. Hear the logs settling and popping as they burn. Outside, snow is beginning to fall and the nearest neighbor is miles away. The perfect setting for the stories I'm about to tell you. Stories that might make you appreciate the company of others just a little bit more. Our first tale comes from Sarah, a marketing executive from Denver who thought she'd found the perfect escape from her high-stress job. She'd booked a weekend at a remote cabin in the Colorado Rockies, a place that promised complete solitude and breathtaking views. What she got instead was an experience that haunts her to this day. Sarah arrived at the cabin on a Friday evening in late October. The rental photos had shown a charming log structure nestled among towering pines, with a wraparound porch and large windows that offered panoramic views of the mountains. What the photos hadn't captured was the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all directions, or the way the shadows between the trees appeared to move when you weren't looking directly at them. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised. Rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating the main room, a compact but well-equipped kitchen, and a loft bedroom accessible by a steep wooden staircase. Sarah spent her first evening unpacking, starting a fire, and settling in with a book and a glass of wine. Everything seemed perfect. It was around midnight when she first heard the footsteps. At first, she dismissed the sound as the old wooden structure settling for the night. Old cabins make noise, she reasoned. But as she lay in the loft bedroom, trying to fall asleep, the sounds continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor below. Back and forth, like someone pacing in the main room. Sarah grabbed her phone and crept to the edge of the loft, peering down into the darkness below. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to make out the furniture. She strained her eyes, looking for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. Convincing herself it was just her imagination amplified by the isolation, Sarah returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, Every whisper of wind through the pines outside seemed magnified in the darkness. And just as she was, finally. Drifting off, the footsteps started again. This time she was certain. Someone or something was walking around downstairs. The measured pace, the weight of each step on the wooden floor, it was unmistakably the sound of footsteps. But who could it be? The cabin was locked, she was miles from any neighbours, and her car was the only vehicle she'd seen on the long dirt road leading to the property. Sarah lay frozen in bed, her heart pounding as the footsteps continued. They seemed to follow a pattern, moving from the fireplace area to the kitchen, then back again, over and over, the same route. She checked her phone. 2:17 a.m. No signal, of course. She was completely cut off from the outside world. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's fear began to mix with curiosity. If someone had broken into the cabin, wouldn't they be searching for valuables, making more noise, trying to leave? These footsteps were almost purposeful, like someone was waiting for something, or perhaps guarding something. Gathering her courage, Sarah grabbed the small flashlight from her bedside table and once again crept to the edge of the loft. The footsteps were directly below her now, and in the dim light from her flashlight beam, she could see the floorboards actually flexing slightly with each step. Someone was definitely down there. But as she watched, something impossible happened. The footsteps continued, the floorboards kept moving, but there was no one there. No person, no shadow, no visible presence of any kind. Just the steady sound of footsteps and the physical evidence of weight pressing down on the wooden floor. Sarah's hands began to shake, and her flashlight beam wavered. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the cabin was built on unstable ground. Maybe there were issues with the foundation that created the illusion of footsteps. But even as she tried to rationalize what she was witnessing, she knew she was grasping at straws. The invisible presence seemed to sense her attention. The footsteps stopped abruptly and the cabin fell into an oppressive silence that was somehow worse than the mysterious sounds. Sarah held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to make any noise that might draw whatever was down there to look up at her. Minutes passed in this tense standoff. Sarah's legs began to cramp from crouching at the edge of the loft, but she didn't dare move. Then, slowly, she heard a new sound. The creak of the wooden staircase leading up to the loft. Something was coming up the stairs. Each step was deliberate and heavy, and Sarah could see the railing actually moving as whatever was climbing the stairs used it for support. But still there was nothing visible, no form, no shadow, just the undeniable evidence that something was ascending toward her. Sarah scrambled backward into the bedroom, her mind racing. The stairs led to only one place, where she was sleeping. Whatever this presence was, it was coming for her. She looked around desperately for another way out, but the loft had only one exit, and that was currently blocked by whatever was on the stairs. The footsteps reached the top of the staircase and stopped. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall of the bedroom, clutching her flashlight like a weapon, though she knew it would be useless against something she couldn't even see. The silence stretched on, broken only by her own rapid breathing and the hammering of her heart. Then, clear as day in the darkness of the loft, she heard a voice. Not spoken aloud, but somehow transmitted directly into her mind. A woman's voice filled with sadness and longing. He promised he'd come back for me. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't just some random haunting or residual energy. This was an intelligent presence, something that was trying to communicate. And suddenly, she understood. This wasn't a malevolent spirit trying to harm her. This was someone who had been waiting, pacing the floors night after night, waiting for someone who would never return. But understanding didn't make the situation any less terrifying. Sarah was trapped in a remote cabin with a ghost, and she had no idea what this spirit might do if it realized she wasn't the person it was waiting for. As if responding to her thoughts, the presence seemed to move closer. The floorboards near the bed creaked, and Sarah felt the mattress shift slightly as something sat down beside her. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and her breath began to form visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. "Where is he?" The voice in her head was more insistent now, tinged with desperation. "He said he'd come back. He promised." Sarah wanted to respond, to somehow communicate that she didn't know who this spirit was, referring to that she was just a stranger who had rented the cabin for the weekend. But fear had stolen her voice. All she could do was Sitley presence waited for in there, frozen, as the ghost answer she couldn't give. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah never fell eyes watching her. The presence asleep never stopped feeling the weight of invisible remained in the room, sometimes moving around, sometimes sitting on the bed, always maintaining that oppressive atmosphere of waiting and longing. As dawn finally began to break through the windows, Sarah felt the atmosphere in the cabin begin to change. The crushing weight of the spirit's attention seemed to lift, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. By full daylight, the presence seemed to have withdrawn, leaving behind only the memory of that desperate voice and the lingering chill of supernatural contact. Sarah packed her belongings as quickly as possible and left the cabin that morning, cutting her weekend retreat short. But the experience stayed with her, haunting her thoughts and dreams. She began researching the history of the cabin, trying to understand who the ghostly woman might have been and what tragedy had bound her to that remote location. What she discovered would chill her even more than her night in the cabin itself. Through old newspaper archives and county records, Sarah uncovered the tragic story behind her supernatural encounter. In 1987, a young woman named Elena Martinez had lived in that very cabin with her boyfriend, a drifter named Marcus who worked seasonal jobs throughout the mountain region. According to the police reports Sarah found, Elena had been found dead in the cabin that November of hypothermia and starvation, apparently from a combination of both. The investigation revealed that Marcus had left in early October, promising Elena he would return within 2 weeks with money from a logging job in the next county. But he never came back. Elena waited for him, refusing to leave the cabin even as her food supplies dwindled and the first snows of winter began to fall. Neighbors who lived miles away reported seeing smoke from the cabin's chimney for weeks, but by the time someone finally checked on the property, it was too late. Elena had died alone, still waiting by that same fireplace where Sarah had warmed herself, still pacing those same floors, still watching out those same windows for a man who would never return. The most chilling detail in the police report was that Elena's body had been found wearing a path in the wooden floor from the fireplace to the kitchen and back again, exactly matching the route of the footsteps Sarah had heard. Marcus was never found. Some said he'd died in a logging accident. Others believed he'd simply moved on to another town, another woman, leaving Elena behind without a second thought. But Elena remained, bound to that cabin by love and loss, still waiting for a promise that would never be fulfilled. Sarah learned that the cabin had been rented sporadically over the years since Elena's death, but most guests left early. The property management company had stopped advertising it as a romantic getaway after too many couples reported relationship problems during their stays. They'd reclassified it as a rustic retreat for those seeking solitude, which was exactly how Sarah had found it. Now let me share with you the second tale from our collection. And this one comes from a group of college friends who thought they were just planning a fun reunion weekend. Sometimes the most innocent gatherings can become the most terrifying experiences, especially when the location you choose has secrets buried deeper than anyone could imagine. This story takes place at Mirror Lake, nestled in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. 4 friends from college, now in their 30s and scattered across different cities, had decided to rent a lakeside cabin for a long weekend in September. They'd been planning this reunion for months, looking forward to rekindling old friendships and escaping their respective responsibilities. The group consisted of David, a lawyer from Manhattan, Jennifer, a teacher from Boston, Mike, a software engineer from Seattle, and Lisa, a nurse from Philadelphia. They'd been inseparable during their college years, but like so many friendships, theirs had drifted as careers and families pulled them in different directions. This weekend was meant to bridge those gaps and recapture some of the magic of their younger days. The cabin they'd rented sat right on the water's edge, with a private dock extending into the pristine lake. The property had been in the same family for generations, recently converted into a vacation rental by the current owners who lived in the main house about a quarter-mile up the hill. The listing had emphasized the cabin's history, dating back to the 1920s, and its reputation as a peaceful retreat where guests could truly disconnect from the modern world. The friends arrived on a Thursday evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains that surrounded the lake. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves were just beginning to turn, creating a picturesque scene that seemed pulled straight from a postcard. They spent their first evening catching up over dinner and drinks, sharing stories about their lives and laughing at old memories from their college days. The cabin itself was charming in that rustic way that city dwellers find so appealing. Knotty pine walls, vintage furniture, and windows that looked out over the still water of Mirror Lake. There was no television or internet, which was exactly what they'd wanted. Just the four of them, the peaceful surroundings and time to reconnect. It was Jennifer who first noticed something odd about the photographs. The cabin was decorated with old family photos spanning several decades, showing various groups of people enjoying the lake property. Summer gatherings, fishing trips, children playing on the dock, the usual collection of memories you'd expect to find in a family cabin. But as Jennifer studied the photos more closely on Friday morning while the others were still sleeping, she noticed something strange. In several of the photographs, spanning different decades and different groups of people, there was always one person who appeared in the background but didn't seem to belong with the main group. A young man, probably in his 20s, with dark hair and intense eyes. He never seemed to be posing with the others, but somehow he appeared in photo after photo, always at the edge of the frame, always watching. Jennifer pointed this out to the others when they gathered for breakfast, and they all agreed it was peculiar. David, with his lawyer's eye for detail, noted that the mysterious figure appeared to be wearing the same clothes in photos that were clearly taken years apart. Mike suggested it might be a family member who was just camera shy, always ending up in the background by coincidence. But Lisa, who had studied psychology, felt there was something unsettling about the figure's expression in the photographs. "Look at his eyes," she said, pointing to one of the clearer images. "He's not looking at the camera, he's looking at the people in the foreground, and not in a friendly way." They might have dismissed the photographs as just an odd curiosity, but then Mike made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring the cabin's small library of books left by previous guests, he found a local history book that contained a chapter about Mirror Lake. What he read there cast their weekend getaway in an entirely different light. According to the book, Mirror Lake had been the site of a tragic drowning in 1952. A young man named Thomas Brennan, who worked as a caretaker for several of the lake properties, had disappeared one night in late September. His body was found 3 days later, floating near the shore, not far from where their cabin now stood. The circumstances of Thomas's death were mysterious. He was known to be an excellent swimmer. The weather had been calm that night, and there was no indication of why he would have been in the water after dark. Some locals suspected foul play, but the investigation was closed when the coroner ruled it an accidental drowning. What made the story particularly relevant to their situation was the description of Thomas Brennan in the book. Dark hair, intense eyes, and according to several witness accounts, he had a habit of watching people from a distance, never quite fitting in with the social gatherings he was hired to help with. The friends compared the description to the figure in the photographs, and the resemblance was unmistakable. They were looking at pictures of a dead man, somehow appearing in family photos taken decades after his death. The discovery cast a pall over their reunion weekend. What had been a relaxing retreat now felt tainted by the knowledge that they were staying at a place connected to tragedy and mystery. But they'd already paid for the weekend, driven hours to get there, and taken time off work. They decided to stay, reasoning that old ghost stories shouldn't ruin their long-planned reunion. That decision would prove to be a mistake. Friday night passed without incident, though several of the friends later admitted they'd had unusually vivid dreams about water and drowning. Saturday brought perfect autumn weather, and they spent the day hiking, exploring the shoreline, and trying to recapture the carefree spirit of their college years. But as evening approached, the atmosphere began to change. The temperature dropped more quickly than seemed natural, and fog began to roll across the lake, even though the weather forecast had called for clear skies. By the time they'd finished dinner, the cabin was surrounded by a thick mist that made it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the windows. It was David who first noticed the figure standing on the dock. He'd gone outside to bring in some chairs they'd left by the water when he saw the silhouette of a person standing at the end of their private dock. The figure was motionless, facing the cabin, barely visible through the heavy fog. "Hey!" David called out, assuming it was someone from the main house coming to check on them. "Everything okay out there?" There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge David's call, just continued standing there in the mist. David walked closer, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the wooden dock. But as he approached, the figure seemed to fade back into the fog, becoming less distinct until it disappeared entirely. By the time David reached the end of the dock, there was no one there. He might have dismissed it as a trick of the fog and shadows, but when he returned to the cabin, he found his friends gathered around the window, all staring out at the lake with expressions of concern and confusion. "Did you see him too?" Jennifer asked. They'd all seen the figure on the dock. All four of them had watched as David approached, and the mysterious presence had simply vanished into the mist. There was no boat at the dock, no way for someone to have left without making noise in the water or on the shore. The friends spent the rest of the evening huddled inside the cabin, trying to rationalize what they'd witnessed. Maybe it had been a neighbor checking on the property. Maybe the fog had created an optical illusion. Maybe they were all letting the story about Thomas Brennan influence their perceptions. But deep down, they all knew they'd seen something that couldn't be easily explained. The real terror began after midnight, when the knocking started. At first, it was just 3 soft knocks on the cabin door. Polite, almost hesitant, like someone who wasn't quite sure they should be there. The friends looked at each other across the dimly lit main room, the dying fire casting long shadows on their faces. "Who would be out there this time of night?" Mike whispered, glancing at his watch, "especially in this fog." David, being the most practical of the group, stood up and walked toward the door. But something made him stop before reaching for the handle. Maybe it was the complete silence that followed the knocking. No footsteps walking away, no voice calling out, no sound of a car or boat that would indicate how someone had arrived. "Hello?" he called through the door. "Is someone there?" The only response was another series of knocks. 3 again, same rhythm, same soft pressure against the wood. But this time they seemed to come from a different part of the door, higher up, as if whoever was knocking had grown taller. Lisa moved to one of the front windows and peered through the glass, but the fog was so thick she couldn't make out anything beyond the porch light's weak glow. "I can't see anyone," she whispered back to the group. The knocking came again, but now it wasn't just at the door. Soft raps echoed from the windows around the cabin, as if someone was walking the perimeter, tapping gently at each pane of glass. The sounds moved in a deliberate pattern, circling the building slowly and methodically. Jennifer grabbed Mike's arm, her fingernails digging into his sleeve. "This isn't real," she said, but her voice betrayed her fear. "People don't just appear and disappear in the fog. There has to be an explanation." But even as she spoke, the knocking grew more insistent. What had started as polite tapping became urgent rapping, as if whoever was outside was becoming impatient with their lack of response. The sounds continued to circle the cabin, faster now, creating a rhythm that seemed almost musical in its precision. David moved away from the door and rejoined his friends in the center of the room. Should we call the owners? He'd let them know someone's prowling around their property. Mike pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal. Nothing. I had 2 bars earlier, but now there's nothing at all. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving them in a silence so complete they could hear each other's breathing. For several minutes they stood frozen, listening for any sound that might indicate their visitor had left. But the fog seemed to muffle everything beyond the cabin walls, creating a sense of isolation that was both protective and terrifying. Then came the sound of the dock. The wooden planks creaked and groaned as if someone was walking across them, the same sounds David had heard earlier when he'd gone outside to investigate the figure in the mist. But this time, the footsteps were different, heavier, more deliberate, and they were heading directly toward the cabin. "Get away from the windows," David instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. The others didn't argue. They moved into the kitchen area, the farthest point from both the front door and the lakeside windows. The footsteps on the dock stopped, replaced by the soft splash of water lapping against the shoreline. Then came a new sound that made their blood run cold, the slow, wet slap of bare feet on the cabin's wooden porch. Whatever had been in the water was now outside their door. The footsteps moved across the porch with that same measured pace they'd heard from the dock, back and forth, like someone pacing or perhaps examining the cabin from different angles. Occasionally, they heard the squeak of wet skin against glass as their visitor pressed against the windows, though they couldn't see anything through the fog-covered panes. Lisa was the first to notice the smell. It started as just a hint of something unpleasant, but gradually grew stronger. The thick, cloying scent of stagnant water and decay, as if something that had been underwater for a very long time was now sharing their space. "Do you smell that?" she whispered, covering her nose with her sleeve. They all did. The odor was seeping into the cabin somehow, despite the closed doors and windows. It carried with it the unmistakable essence of the lake's depths, of mud and rotting vegetation, and things that had been dead for far too long. Jennifer started to cry quietly, not from fear alone, but from a growing sense that they were trapped in something far beyond their understanding. This wasn't just a ghost story or local legend. This was something real and immediate and focused on them. The wet footsteps stopped directly in front of the main window that looked out over the lake. Through the fog-covered glass, they could make out a darker shape pressed against the pane. It was roughly human-sized, but there was something wrong with its proportions, as if the figure had been distorted by long submersion in water. Then, impossibly, they heard a voice, muffled and distorted, like someone speaking underwater, but unmistakably human. It was calling a name over and over, but the words were so garbled by the glass and fog that they couldn't make out what it was saying. David crept closer to the window, trying to understand what the voice was repeating. As he got within a few feet of the glass, the figure on the other side seemed to sense his presence. The dark shape pressed closer to the window, and suddenly the fog cleared just enough for them to see what was looking back at them. It was a face, but not one that belonged to the living. The features were bloated and pale, with dark hollows where the eyes should have been. Water streamed constantly from the mouth and nose, and the skin had the greyish tint of something that had been submerged for decades. But what terrified David most was the expression of desperate recognition on that ruined face. The thing outside wasn't just haunting the cabin randomly, it was looking for someone specific, and it seemed to believe it had found them. David stumbled backward, knocking into a chair and alerting his friends to his discovery. "Don't look," he managed to say, but it was too late. Mike had already moved to another window and was staring out at their visitor with a mixture of horror and fascination. "It's him," Mike said, his voice hollow with shock. "It's Thomas Brennan, the man from the photographs." But something was different about this manifestation. The figure they were seeing wasn't the young caretaker from the 1950s. This was what Thomas had become after 70 years in the dark waters of Mirror Lake. Death had changed him, twisted him into something that barely retained human shape. The voice outside grew more insistent, and finally they could make out what it was saying. Over and over, in that wet, distorted tone, it was calling a single name. "Margaret, Margaret, Margaret." Jennifer gasped. "That's my middle name, Margaret. I've never liked it, so I never use it, but it's on all my identification." The pieces began to fall into place with horrifying clarity. Thomas Brennan hadn't died accidentally. According to the local history, he'd been obsessed with a young woman named Margaret, who had worked at one of the other lake properties that summer. She'd rejected his advances repeatedly, and some of the older locals had whispered that his death might have been suicide, a final desperate act when he realized she would never return his feelings. But Margaret had left the lake at the end of that summer, never knowing about Thomas's death or his obsession with her. She'd gone on to live her life, marry, have children, and eventually grandchildren. And now, 70 years later, her namesake had returned to Mirror Lake, and Thomas's restless spirit had awakened with the desperate hope that his Margaret had finally come back to him. The thing outside the window had stopped calling and was now simply watching them through the glass. Its hollow eye sockets seemed fixed on Jennifer, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. "He thinks I'm her," Jennifer whispered. "He thinks I'm Margaret." The implications of this realization settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They weren't dealing with a random haunting or residual energy. They were trapped in a cabin with the spirit of a man who had died waiting for a woman who never came, and now he believed that woman had returned to him. David tried to think rationally about their situation. They were 4 adults, educated and capable people. There had to be a way to resolve this peacefully. Maybe if we just wait until morning, he'll go away. Ghosts are supposed to be weaker in daylight, right? But even as he said it, they all knew that morning was still hours away, and the presence outside showed no signs of leaving. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger, more solid, more determined. The smell of stagnant water was getting worse, and now they could hear other sounds from outside. The splash and gurgle of lake water, as if small waves were lapping at the cabin's foundation. But that was impossible. The cabin sat several feet above the water level, with a clear stretch of beach between the building and the lake's edge. Lisa moved to the kitchen window and looked out toward the water. What she saw made her stumble backward in shock. "The lake," she managed to say. "The lake is rising." The others rushed to the windows and confirmed her observation. The water level was indeed rising, impossibly fast, and without any natural explanation. What had been a peaceful lakeside setting was becoming something far more threatening. The fog seemed to be moving with the water, creeping up from the lake's surface and beginning to seep under the cabin's doors and through the gaps around the windows. Mike grabbed his phone again, desperately hoping for a signal that would allow them to call for help. But the screen remained blank, showing no bars and no connection to the outside world. They were completely cut off, trapped in a cabin that was slowly being surrounded by water and fog that carried with it the presence of a lovesick ghost who had waited 70 years for this moment. The wet footsteps on the porch had multiplied. What had started as the sound of one person walking back and forth had become a chorus of movement, as if Thomas Brennan wasn't alone anymore, as if the rising lake had awakened other things that had been sleeping in its depths. Jennifer found herself pressed against the far wall of the cabin, as far from the windows as she could get. But she could feel eyes watching her from every direction, and the constant repetition of her middle name had become a whispered chant that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Margaret, Margaret, come to the water, Margaret." The voice was no longer coming from outside. It was inside the cabin with them, carried on the fog that was now seeping through every crack and crevice. and with that voice came the unmistakable presence of someone who had been waiting far too long for love that would never be returned. The friends huddled together in the center of the main room, watching as the supernatural forces gathering around their cabin grew stronger with each passing minute. They'd come to Mirror Lake looking for a peaceful reunion, a chance to reconnect with old friendships and simpler times. Instead, they'd found themselves at the center of a tragedy that had been building for 70 years, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to finally reach its climax. And now, with the lake rising around them and the desperate spirit of Thomas Brennan growing more solid and determined with each passing moment, they realized that their weekend reunion might become something far more permanent than they'd ever intended. The fog continued to pour into the cabin, bringing with it the sounds of the deep water and the whispered promises of a dead man who refused to accept that his Margaret would never love him back. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted as the fog thickened, and the friends could see their breath-forming clouds in the suddenly Arctic air. The supernatural mist wasn't just bringing cold with it, it was bringing something far more sinister. Within the swirling grey mass they began to make out shapes, dark forms that moved with purpose through the otherworldly haze. Jennifer's teeth were chattering now, not just from fear but from the bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from whatever was approaching through the fog. The whispered chanting of her name had grown louder, more insistent, and she could swear she heard other voices joining in, creating a chorus of the dead that echoed through the cabin's wooden walls. "We need to get out of here," David said, his practical nature finally overriding his attempts to rationalize what they were experiencing. "Car keys now. We're leaving." But Mike was already shaking his head, pointing toward the front door. "Look at the water level. It's already reached the porch. Even if we could get to the car, the road is probably flooded by now." Through the fog-covered windows, they could see that he was right. The impossible rise of Mirror Lake had transformed their peaceful retreat into an island, cut off from the mainland by dark water that reflected no light and seemed to absorb sound itself. The rental car was nowhere to be seen, presumably swallowed by the supernatural flood that defied every law of physics they understood. Lisa grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and aimed its beam toward the nearest window. The light seemed to struggle through the fog, creating strange refractions and shadows that made it impossible to determine what was real and what was illusion. But one thing was clear, there were definitely figures moving in the mist around the cabin. Multiple shapes, all walking with that same slow, deliberate pace they'd first heard on the dock. "How many do you think are out there?" she whispered, playing the light across different windows. Jennifer had stopped trying to count. Every time the beam illuminated a section of fog, she caught glimpses of waterlogged forms shambling through the mist. Some appeared more solid than others, as if death had affected them differently, but all shared that same purposeful movement toward the cabin where she waited. The chanting grew more complex, weaving her name into what sounded like a wedding song or love ballad, distorted by decades of underwater decay. The voices rose and fell in harmonies that should have been beautiful, but instead filled the friends with a dread so profound it seemed to settle into their bones. Then the knocking resumed, but this time it wasn't the polite tapping they'd heard before. Heavy, wet fists pounded against every surface of the cabin. The doors, the windows, even the walls themselves shook under the assault of the desperate dead. The sound was deafening, a percussion of longing and rage that made conversation impossible. Mike pointed frantically toward the loft, shouting over the noise. They couldn't stay on the main floor much longer. The fog was getting thicker, and with it came that overwhelming smell of decay and stagnant water. Worse, the temperature was dropping so rapidly that ice crystals were beginning to form on the inside of the windows. The four friends scrambled up the narrow staircase to the cabin's small loft bedroom, hoping the elevation might provide some protection from whatever was gathering below. But as they reached the upper level, they realized their mistake. The loft had only one way down, and they'd just trapped themselves in a space with no escape route. From their elevated position, they could look down through the main room's windows and see the full scope of what was happening outside. The fog had organized itself into distinct shapes now, and they counted at least a dozen figures surrounding the cabin. Some stood in the water that now lapped at the building's foundation. Others had positioned themselves on what remained of the porch and dock. But it was the figure directly below the loft window that commanded their attention. Thomas Brennan stood in water up to his waist, his arms raised toward the cabin, his mouth open in what might have been song or scream. The decades underwater had transformed him into something barely human, but his intent was unmistakable. He was conducting the other spirits like a choir, orchestrating their assault on the cabin and the woman he believed was his long-lost love. Jennifer found herself drawn to the window, despite every instinct telling her to stay back. There was something hypnotic about the scene below, something that called to a part of her mind that recognized the tragedy and obsession driving these restless dead. "He really loved her," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the supernatural cacophony. "That's not love," Lisa replied sharply, her medical training helping her recognize the signs of dangerous obsession. "That's possession, control. Whatever he felt for Margaret, this isn't about love anymore. This is about a man who couldn't accept rejection, even in death." But Jennifer seemed unable to look away from the figure in the water. Thomas had noticed her at the window, and his hollow eye sockets were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When their gazes met, the chanting from the other spirits grew louder, more triumphant, as if they sensed victory approaching. The pounding on the cabin walls intensified, and now they could hear wood beginning to splinter under the assault. Whatever protection the building had offered was failing, and the supernatural forces outside were growing strong enough to break through physical barriers. David tried the landline phone in the loft bedroom, but the line was completely dead. Their cell phones showed not just no signal, but no power at all, as if the electromagnetic fields around the cabin had been disrupted by the paranormal activity. They were cut off from help, trapped in a disintegrating shelter with nowhere to run. That's when Jennifer made a decision that terrified her friends. She started toward the loft stairs, moving with the same dreamlike quality they'd seen in horror movies when characters walked willingly toward danger. "I have to talk to him," she said, her voice strangely calm despite the chaos around them. "He's been waiting for 70 years. Maybe if I explain that I'm not Margaret, that she lived her life and died peacefully, he'll let us go." Mike grabbed her arm, stopping her descent. "Are you insane? You can't go out there. Look what's happening to this place." But Jennifer pulled free with surprising strength. "Don't you see? This is never going to stop. Every time someone named Margaret comes to this lake, this will happen. He'll keep waiting, keep hoping, keep trapping innocent people in his delusion. Someone has to break the cycle." Lisa tried a different approach, appealing to Jennifer's rational mind. "Even if you're right about breaking the cycle, you don't know what he'll do when he realizes you're not her. Disappointed ghosts don't usually just say thanks and move on. They get angry." The cabin shuddered under another wave of attacks from outside. Through the windows they could see that the other spirits were becoming more solid, more focused. What had started as vague shapes in the fog were now clearly recognizable as human forms, all of them showing the signs of death by drowning. Some were recent additions to Mirror Lake's collection of victims. Others appeared to have been there for decades. Jennifer paused at the top of the stairs, looking back at her friends with an expression that mixed terror with determination. "I'm a teacher," she said simply. "I've spent my career helping people understand difficult truths. Maybe I can help Thomas understand this one." But before she could take another step, the cabin's main door exploded inward, torn from its hinges by forces that shouldn't exist in the natural world. Lake water poured through the opening, carrying with it the smell of death and the sound of voices raised in supernatural celebration. The friends pressed themselves against the far wall of the loft as water began to flow up the stairs, defying gravity in its eagerness to reach them. Within the rising flood, they could see shapes moving, spirits that had been waiting in Mirror Lake's depths for their chance to walk on land again. Thomas Brennan appeared in the doorway, water streaming from his decayed form, his hollow gaze fixed on Jennifer with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate with desperate longing. When he spoke, his voice filled the entire cabin, echoing from every surface with the power of 7 decades of unfulfilled desire. "Margaret," he said, and the word carried with it all the pain and obsession that had kept him bound to this place. "You came back to me. You kept your promise." Jennifer stepped forward despite her friend's protests, her hands raised in what she hoped was a calming gesture. "I'm not Margaret," she said clearly, her teacher's voice cutting through the supernatural chaos. "My name is Jennifer. Margaret lived her life and died years ago. She never knew how you felt about her." The effect of her words was immediate and devastating. Thomas's form flickered like a candle flame in wind, and the other spirits in the water below began to wail with voices that sounded like the lake itself crying out in anguish. The temperature dropped even further, and frost began to form on every surface as the ghost processed this revelation. "No," Thomas said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute despair. "You're lying. She promised she would return. She said she cared for me." Jennifer felt her heart break a little for the tortured spirit, even as she recognized the dangerous delusion driving his actions. "She never promised anything," she said gently. "You created that promise in your own mind because you couldn't accept that she didn't feel the same way about you." The cabin began to shake violently as Thomas's emotional state deteriorated. The other spirits in the water below seemed to feed off his anguish, becoming more solid and aggressive with each passing second. What had been a focused haunting was transforming into something chaotic and destructive. David realized they had perhaps minutes before the entire structure collapsed under the supernatural assault. "Jennifer, whatever you're going to do it fast. This place is coming apart." But Jennifer was committed to her course now, even as the floorboards beneath her feet began to crack and warp from the otherworldly forces tearing at the cabin's foundation. She took another step toward Thomas, close enough now that she could see the decades of lake water that perpetually flowed from his eyes like tears. "Listen to me," she said, putting all her authority as an educator into her voice. Margaret was a real person with her own life, her own choices, her own dreams. She wasn't a possession to be claimed or a prize to be won. She was a human being who deserved to make her own decisions about love. Thomas's form solidified slightly, as if her words were forcing him to confront truths he'd spent 70 years avoiding. "But I loved her," he said, and for a moment his voice sounded almost human again. "I know you did," Jennifer replied, her tone softening with genuine compassion. "But love isn't about holding someone prisoner with your feelings. It's not about refusing to let them live their lives because you can't imagine yours without them. Real love means wanting someone to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include you." The other spirits in the water had gone silent, as if they too were listening to this conversation that might determine their fate. The cabin stopped shaking, creating an eerie calm that felt like the eye of a supernatural storm. Thomas stared at Jennifer for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with concepts that challenged everything he'd believed about love and possession and the right to claim another person's affection. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "She was happy? Without me?" Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her face as she recognized the genuine pain behind his question. "She was. She married someone who loved her the way she deserved to be loved. She had children and grandchildren. She lived a full life, and she was grateful for every day of it." The change in Thomas was visible and profound. The desperate obsession that had sustained him for decades began to crack, and with it, his ability to maintain his presence in the physical world. He looked down at his hands as they became translucent, then back at Jennifer, with something that might have been gratitude. "I kept her from having that life," he said, understanding finally dawning. My obsession, my refusal to let go, it would have destroyed everything she valued. But it didn't, Jennifer assured him. She escaped. She lived. She loved, and was loved in return. Your tragedy doesn't have to be hers. Thomas nodded slowly, and as he did, the water that had flooded the cabin began to recede. The other spirits in the lake started to fade as well, their connection to the physical world severed by their leader's acceptance of reality. "Tell me about her life," Thomas said, his form now so translucent that the friends could see through him to the water beyond. "Tell me she was happy." Jennifer smiled through her tears. She was radiant. She laughed easily, loved deeply, and never let fear keep her from embracing new experiences. She lived exactly the kind of life that someone who truly loved her would want her to have. With those words, Thomas Brennan finally let go. His form dissolved like mist in sunlight, and with him went the supernatural storm that had trapped them in the cabin. The fog lifted, the water receded to its normal level, and the temperature began to return to normal. The four friends stood in the destroyed cabin, surrounded by broken furniture and water damage, but alive and free. Through the now clear windows they could see Mirror Lake as it truly was, a peaceful body of water reflecting the stars, no longer hiding the desperate spirits of the drowned. "Is it over?" Mike asked, hardly daring to believe they'd survived. Jennifer nodded, though she felt drained by the emotional intensity of her confrontation with Thomas. "I think so. He finally understood that love isn't about possession, it's about letting go when holding on causes pain." They spent the rest of the night in the damaged cabin, too shaken to attempt the drive home in darkness. But as dawn broke over Mirror Lake, they saw something beautiful. The water sparkled in the morning light with a clarity it hadn't possessed before, as if the lifting of Thomas's obsession had purified the entire lake. When they finally packed their belongings and prepared to leave, Jennifer took one last look at the family photographs that still decorated the cabin walls. The mysterious figure that had appeared in image after image was gone now, no longer trapped between worlds by his inability to accept rejection. Their weekend reunion had become something none of them would ever forget, a reminder that love, when twisted by obsession and refusal to let go, can become the most destructive force imaginable. But they'd also learned that sometimes all it takes to break a cycle of supernatural torment is someone willing to speak the truth with compassion, even to the dead. As they drove away from Mirror Lake, Jennifer reflected on the lesson she'd both taught and learned. Real love requires the courage to let go, to allow the object of your affection to choose their own path, even if that path doesn't include you. Thomas Brennan had spent 70 years learning that lesson, but in the end, it had set him free. Now, as the fire crackles lower in our cabin fireplace and the shadows grow longer on these wooden walls, let me share with you our third tale. This one comes from a man who thought he understood solitude, who believed that isolation would provide the perfect environment for creativity and self-discovery. Sometimes the most dangerous thing about being alone isn't what might find you in the wilderness, but what might already be waiting inside the places we choose for our retreats. Marcus Webb was a successful novelist from Chicago who had reached that dangerous point in his career where success had become a burden rather than a blessing. His latest book had topped the bestseller lists, but the pressure to produce another hit was crushing his creative spirit. Deadlines loomed, publishers demanded, and the constant noise of city life made it impossible to find the quiet space his mind needed to create. That's why he'd rented the cabin in northern Minnesota for an entire month, far from phone service and internet connectivity, surrounded by thousands of acres of pristine wilderness. The property management company had advertised it as the perfect writer's retreat, a place where creative minds could find the silence and solitude necessary for their craft. The cabin itself was more substantial than the previous properties we've discussed tonight. Built in the 1940s as a hunting lodge, it featured a large main room with a stone fireplace, a well-equipped kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and most importantly, for Marcus, a small study lined with built-in bookshelves where he could set up his writing space. What the rental listing hadn't mentioned was the cabin's more recent history, or why it had been sitting empty for the past 3 years before being converted into a vacation rental. Marcus arrived on a grey October afternoon, his car loaded with supplies, research materials, and the laptop that would hopefully produce his next novel. The drive from the main road had taken nearly an hour on progressively smaller dirt tracks, and by the time he reached the cabin, he felt truly disconnected from civilization. The isolation was exactly what he'd been seeking. No traffic sounds, no city lights, no human voices except his own, just the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of loons from the lake that lay hidden somewhere in the forest beyond his clearing. He spent his first evening unpacking and settling in, arranging his writing materials in the study and familiarizing himself with the cabin's layout and systems. Everything seemed perfect for his purposes. The silence was profound, the solitude complete, and his mind already began to quiet from the constant chatter that had plagued him in Chicago. That night, Marcus slept better than he had in months, lulled by the absolute quiet and the knowledge that no one would disturb his creative process for the next 30 days. He woke refreshed and eager to begin writing, but as he sat down at his laptop in the study the next morning, he noticed something odd. Several of the books on the built-in shelves appeared to have been moved. He was certain he'd arranged them alphabetically the night before, but now they seemed randomly placed, as if someone had been examining them and put them back carelessly. Marcus checked the cabin's doors and windows, but everything was securely locked from the inside. There were no signs of intrusion, no evidence that anyone had entered during the night. He concluded that he must have misremembered how he'd organized the books and turned his attention to his writing. But concentration proved elusive. Every time he began to find his rhythm with the story, some small sound would break his focus. The creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind under the eaves, the soft thud of something falling in another room. Old cabins make noise, he told himself, but the sounds seemed too purposeful, too timed to be random settling. By mid-afternoon, Marcus had managed to write only a few paragraphs. Frustrated with his lack of progress, he decided to take a break and explore the surrounding forest. Perhaps a walk would clear his mind and restore his creative energy. The woods around the cabin were dense and old, filled with towering pines that blocked most of the sunlight and created a perpetual twilight atmosphere beneath their branches. Marcus followed what appeared to be an old hunting trail, enjoying the solitude and the way the forest sounds seemed to absorb his footsteps. It was about a mile from the cabin that he discovered the graves. They weren't in a formal cemetery, just 3 simple headstones arranged in a small clearing where the trees opened up to let in more light. The graves were well maintained despite their isolation, with fresh flowers placed at the base of each marker. Someone had been caring for these sites recently. Marcus approached the headstones, curious about who might be buried so far from any town or church. The inscriptions were simple but telling. Robert Hayes, 1923 to 1987, beloved husband and father. Martha Hayes, 1925 to 1989, devoted wife and mother. Samuel Hayes, 1950 to 1987, our dear son. The dates on 2 of the graves caught his attention immediately. Robert and Samuel had died in the same year, just 2 years before Martha. Some tragedy had taken the father and son together, leaving Martha alone until she joined them 2 years later. But what disturbed Marcus most was the realization that these graves were on the same property as his rental cabin. The Hayes family had lived and died on this land, and based on the dates, they'd probably lived in the very cabin where he was now staying. The discovery cast a shadow over his retreat. He'd come here seeking solitude, but apparently he was sharing the property with the dead. As he walked back through the darkening forest, Marcus found himself wondering what had happened to the Hayes family and whether their presence might explain the restless feeling he'd experienced in the cabin. That evening, he tried to research the family online, but the cabin's promised lack of internet connectivity made investigation impossible. He was left with his imagination to fill in the details, and imagination was both his greatest tool and his greatest curse. Marcus spent the evening reading by the fireplace, trying to push thoughts of the graves from his mind. But as the fire died down and the cabin settled into the deep quiet of the wilderness night, he began to notice sounds that seemed distinctly out of place. Footsteps in the main room, slow and careful, like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping household. The soft whisper of pages turning as if someone was reading in another part of the cabin. The gentle creak of floorboards under careful weight. At first, Marcus tried to ignore these sounds, attributing them to his overactive imagination and the stress of his writing deadline. But as the hours passed, the sounds became more distinct, more purposeful, impossible to dismiss as the random settling of an old building. Around midnight, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the distinctive sound of typewriter keys echoing from the direction of the study where he'd set up his writing space. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the study, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The typing sounds continued as he approached, steady and rhythmic, like someone working on a long document with practiced efficiency. But when he reached the study doorway and shined his light into the room, there was no one there. His laptop sat closed on the desk exactly where he'd left it, and the old manual typewriter he'd noticed on one of the shelves remained in its place, covered with a thin layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed. Yet even as he stood in the doorway, he could still hear the phantom typing, as if invisible hands were working at a keyboard that existed in some other dimension overlapping his own. Marcus backed away from the study, his rational mind struggling to process what his senses were telling him. He'd experienced writer's block before, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't stress or imagination, this was a genuine supernatural encounter, and he was alone in the wilderness with no way to call for help or escape until his rental period ended. The typing continued throughout the night, sometimes from the study, sometimes from the main room, occasionally from the bedroom he wasn't using. It had a rhythm and purpose that suggested someone was working on a long, complex project, the kind of sustained effort that Marcus recognized from his own writing sessions. By dawn, the sounds had faded, leaving Marcus exhausted and shaken. He'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, and even those had been filled with dreams of ghostly figures hunched over typewriters, their fingers flying across keys that made no marks on invisible paper. Despite his lack of rest, Marcus was determined to maintain his writing schedule. He'd paid for a month of solitude, and he wasn't going to let supernatural activity derail his work. But as he opened his laptop and prepared to write, he discovered something that changed everything. There was a new document on his desktop, one he hadn't created. The file was titled Our Story and contained several pages of text that definitely weren't his work. The writing style was different, more formal and old-fashioned, like something from an earlier era. Marcus opened the document and began to read, his amazement growing with each paragraph. The text told the story of the Hayes family, written from the perspective of Robert Hayes himself. It described their life in the cabin, their love for the isolated property, and the tragedy that had destroyed their family in 1987. According to the document, Samuel Hayes had been helping his father with maintenance work on the cabin's roof when a section of rotted timber had given way. Both men had fallen, Robert breaking his neck instantly while Samuel lingered for several hours with internal injuries before dying in his mother's arms. Martha had lived alone in the cabin for 2 more years, unable to leave the place where her husband and son had died, sustained only by her belief that their spirits remained with her in the wilderness they'd all loved. She died of a heart attack in 1989, found weeks later by a concerned neighbor who'd noticed her mail piling up in town. The document continued with a message that seemed directed specifically at Marcus. We know why you've come here. The solitude, the quiet, the space to think and create. We understand because we felt the same way about this place. The cabin welcomed us, sheltered us, became the center of our world. Even in death we cannot leave it behind. We don't wish to frighten you, but we cannot help but be drawn to your work. In life, I was a writer too, though not a successful one, like yourself. I spent many hours in that study working on stories that never found their audience. Perhaps that's why we remain, because there were so many words left unspoken, so many stories left unfinished. We offer you a bargain. Share this space with us, allow us to help with your work, and we will ensure you find the inspiration you seek. Reject us, and we fear the loneliness may drive us to less pleasant methods of seeking attention. The document ended there, but Marcus understood the implications clearly. He was sharing the cabin with the ghosts of the Hayes family, and they wanted to collaborate on his writing project. The question was whether this was an opportunity or a threat. Over the next several days, Marcus experimented with what could only be described as supernatural collaboration. Each morning, he would find new text added to his work, written in the same formal style as Robert Hayes's introduction. The additions were always relevant to his story, often improving scenes he'd struggled with or providing historical details that enriched his narrative. But there was a price for this ghostly assistance. The Hayes family wanted more than just to help with his writing. They wanted acknowledgement, recognition, a sense that their contributions mattered. They began to demand leaving him notes, not just about the novel, but about their own lives, their unfulfilled dreams, their desperate need to be remembered by the living world. Marcus found these personal messages increasingly disturbing. Martha would write long, rambling letters about her loneliness after losing her husband and son, describing how she would set the table for 3 people every night and carry on conversations with empty chairs. Samuel left angry, bitter notes about his life being cut short, just as he was beginning to discover his own talents and ambitions. But it was Robert's communications that unnerved Marcus the most. The ghostly patriarch seemed to view their collaboration as a form of possession, writing messages that suggested he believed he was gradually taking over Marcus's creative process entirely. "You understand now," one note read, "that the best writing comes from those who have experienced the full spectrum of human emotion, including death itself. Your living perspective is limited, constrained by hope and fear of the unknown. Allow us to guide your words, and your work will achieve a depth that no living writer can match." Marcus began to notice changes in his own writing style. Phrases and sentences he didn't remember composing appeared in his work, always skillfully integrated but distinctly different from his usual voice. The ghostly influence was becoming stronger, more invasive, and he started to wonder if he was losing control of his own creative process. The physical manifestations grew more intense as well. Books rearranged themselves nightly, sometimes spelling out messages with their spines. The typewriter in the study began operating on its own, producing pages of text that appeared blank, but revealed writing when held up to the firelight. Most disturbing of all, Marcus began to see the Hayes family themselves, translucent figures that appeared in his peripheral vision, but vanished when he turned to look directly at them. Robert appeared as a tall, gaunt man in his 60s, always dressed in work clothes and carrying the tools of whatever maintenance project had killed him. Samuel manifested as a young man, frozen at the moment of his death, his face contorted with pain and his body bent at unnatural angles. But it was Martha who frightened Marcus most, appearing as she had during her 2 years of solitude, hollow-eyed and speaking constantly to her dead husband and son as if they were standing beside her. The collaboration that had begun as an interesting experiment was becoming a nightmare of supernatural possession. Marcus realized that the Hayes family didn't just want to help with his writing, they wanted to use his living energy to complete their own unfinished business, to tell their story through his voice and his reputation. By the end of his 2nd week at the cabin, Marcus was barely sleeping and eating irregularly. The constant presence of the dead was wearing him down physically and emotionally, but every time he considered leaving early, he would find new text in his document that was so brilliant, so perfectly crafted, that he couldn't bring himself to abandon the project. The novel was becoming something extraordinary under the ghostly influence, but Marcus was beginning to suspect that its completion might cost him more than just his peace of mind. The Hayes family seemed to be drawing energy from his presence. growing stronger and more solid with each passing day, while he grew weaker and more disconnected from the living world. The crisis came during his third week when Marcus woke one morning to find that an entire chapter had been added to his novel overnight. But this chapter wasn't just influenced by the Hayes family, it was written entirely from their perspective, describing in vivid detail their deaths and their years of haunting the empty cabin. More disturbing still, the chapter ended with a scene that hadn't happened yet, Marcus's own death in the cabin, joining the Hayes family in their eternal residence on the property. According to the ghostly narrative, he would suffer a fatal heart attack brought on by the stress of supernatural contact, dying alone at his writing desk with his masterpiece finally complete. This is how all great writers should die, the Phantom chapter concluded, at the moment of their greatest achievement, ensuring their work will never be surpassed by inferior efforts. Marcus realized with growing horror that the Hayes family had never intended this to be a temporary collaboration. They wanted him to join them permanently, to become the fourth resident ghost haunting their isolated cabin. His novel would be published posthumously, achieving the kind of legendary status that comes with tragic circumstances, while his spirit would remain trapped in the wilderness forever. That night, as the ghostly typing resumed in the study, Marcus made a desperate decision. He gathered all his belongings and loaded them into his car, determined to leave the cabin immediately despite the darkness and the treacherous forest roads. But as he reached for his car keys, he found them missing. A search of the cabin revealed them sitting on his writing desk, surrounded by pages of text written in the Hayes family's distinctive style. The message was clear. They wouldn't let him leave until their story was complete. Marcus tried the car anyway, but the engine wouldn't turn. Over. He checked under the hood with his flashlight and found that someone or something had removed several critical components, leaving the vehicle completely disabled. He was stranded in the wilderness with 3 ghosts who had decided he belonged with them permanently. The next morning brought a new horror. Marcus's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a face that was gaunt and pale, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look like he was already halfway to joining the dead. The Hayes family's influence was literally draining the life from him, using his energy to sustain their presence in the physical world. He tried to hike out of the forest, but every trail seemed to lead him back to the cabin. The woods themselves appeared to be conspiring to keep him trapped, paths disappearing and reappearing, landmarks shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. The Hayes family had claimed this entire section of wilderness as their domain, and they weren't going to let their new collaborator escape. By his 4th week, Marcus had given up trying to leave. He was too weak to make another escape attempt, and the novel had grown into something that consumed all his attention. Under the ghostly influence, his writing had achieved a depth and power he'd never experienced before, but he could feel his own personality dissolving into the collective consciousness of the Hayes family. The typing sounds no longer came from invisible sources. Now Marcus found himself working at the old manual typewriter, his fingers moving without conscious direction, producing text in a style that blended his voice with those of his supernatural collaborators. He was becoming part of their story, just as they had become part of his. On the final night of his planned stay, Marcus sat at the typewriter working on what he knew would be the novel's conclusion. But the words appearing on the page weren't describing the fictional story he'd come to write. Instead, they were documenting his own experience at the cabin, his gradual absorption into the Hayes family's eternal presence. As he typed the final sentences, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The exhaustion and fear of the past weeks were fading, replaced by a calm acceptance of his fate. He was joining something larger than himself, becoming part of a creative collective that transcended death itself. The novel was complete, a masterpiece that would ensure his literary immortality. And Marcus Webb, successful novelist from Chicago, quietly took his place as the 4th ghost haunting the cabin in the Minnesota wilderness. The property management company found his body 6 weeks later when he failed to check out as scheduled. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by exhaustion and poor nutrition. His completed novel was discovered beside the typewriter, a work of such extraordinary quality that it immediately became a posthumous bestseller. The cabin was quietly removed from the rental listings after Marcus's death, the property owners deciding that some locations weren't suitable for guests seeking solitude. But local hunters sometimes report seeing lights in the windows on winter nights and the sound of typing echoing through the forest when the wind is still. 4 ghosts now haunt that isolated cabin, bound together by their shared love of storytelling and their refusal to let death interrupt their creative work. They wait patiently for the next writer to discover their retreat, ready to offer collaboration to anyone brave or foolish enough to accept their supernatural assistance. The lesson of Marcus Webb's fate is clear. Sometimes the price of perfect inspiration is higher than any living artist should be willing to pay. But for those who value their art above their lives, the Hayes family cabin remains available, hidden deep in the Minnesota wilderness, where the typing never stops and the stories never end. Now, as we reach the midpoint of our evening together, let me pause to add another log to our fire and pour myself another cup of coffee. The flames are dancing higher now, casting longer shadows on our cabin walls, and I can hear the wind picking up outside our own windows. These stories we've shared so far have a common thread, don't they? They're all about people who sought isolation, who thought they understood what solitude truly meant, only to discover that some places are never truly empty. The wilderness holds memories, and sometimes those memories have consciousness, will, and the power to reach across the boundary between life and death. But our next tale is different. This one comes from a family who didn't choose isolation, who found themselves trapped in a remote location by circumstances beyond their control. Sometimes the most terrifying supernatural encounters happen not to those who seek them out, but to ordinary people who stumble into situations where the veil between worlds has grown dangerously thin. The Morrison family's ordeal began on what should have been a routine winter vacation. James and Carol Morrison had planned a ski weekend at a mountain resort in Vermont with their 2 teenage children, Emma and Tyler. It was meant to be a chance to reconnect as a family, to escape the pressures of work and school, and enjoy some quality time together in a winter wonderland setting. The resort they'd booked was one of those picturesque New England establishments that advertise themselves as having rustic charm and authentic mountain atmosphere. The Pinebrook Lodge sat nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-covered peaks, accessible only by a winding mountain road that became treacherous in bad weather. The Morrisons arrived on a Friday evening in mid-January, their SUV loaded with ski equipment and winter gear. The lodge itself was exactly what they'd hoped for, a grand timber frame building with a massive stone fireplace in the lobby, rustic furniture made from local wood, and panoramic windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. Their room was on the 3rd floor, a family suite with 2 bedrooms and a sitting area that looked out over the main ski slopes. Everything seemed perfect for a relaxing weekend away from their busy lives in Boston. The first sign that something was wrong came during dinner in the lodge's dining room. The Morrisons noticed that they were among only a handful of guests, despite it being peak ski season. When James asked their server about the low occupancy, the young woman's response was evasive and uncomfortable. "We've had some unusual weather lately," she said, avoiding eye contact. "Some guests have decided to cut their visits short." But the weather looked perfect for skiing from what the family could see through the dining room windows. Fresh powder had fallen the night before, and the forecast called for clear skies and moderate temperatures. There was no obvious reason why guests would be leaving early. The server's discomfort became more pronounced when Emma asked about the lodge's history, mentioning that she'd read online about the building dating back to the 1920s. The woman actually paled at the question, glancing nervously toward the kitchen before hurrying away with their order. Carol and James exchanged glances across the table, both sensing that something was being left unsaid. but they were determined not to let mysterious staff behavior ruin their family vacation, so they finished their meal and retired to their room for an early night before hitting the slopes the next morning. It was around 2 a.m. when the children started screaming. James and Carol bolted upright in their bed, instantly alert, as their parental instincts responded to their children's obvious terror. The screams were coming from Emma and Tyler's room, not the usual complaints about bad dreams, but genuine, primal sounds of fear that sent ice through their parents' veins. They rushed into the adjoining bedroom to find both teenagers pressed against the far wall, pointing at the window that looked out over the ski slopes. Emma was sobbing, and Tyler's face was sheet white with shock.
"There's someone out there,"
Emma managed to say through her tears.
"Someone on the mountain. They were waving at us."
James looked out the window but saw nothing unusual. The ski slopes were empty and peaceful under the starlight, unmarked snow stretching down the mountainside like a blank canvas.
"I don't see anyone, honey. Maybe it was shadows from the trees or—"
"No, Dad," Tyler interrupted, his voice shaking. "It was a person, a woman in a white dress. She was standing right there on the slope, looking up at our window. When she saw us watching, she started waving, but not like she was being friendly, like she was trying to get us to come outside." Carol moved to the window for her own look, but, like her husband, she saw only empty snow and sleeping forest. "Sweetheart, you might have been dreaming. Sometimes when you're in a new place—" "We were both awake," Emma insisted. "We were talking about going skiing tomorrow when we saw her. She was real, Mum, and there was something wrong with the way she moved." The family spent the next hour trying to calm the children and rationalize what they might have seen. Maybe it had been a late-night skier, though that would be extremely dangerous and against all lodge policies. Maybe it was a staff member doing some kind of maintenance work, though that seemed unlikely at 2 a.m. Whatever the explanation, the children were genuinely frightened, and their parents decided to stay with them for the rest of the night. But sleep didn't come easily for any of them. Every few minutes, one of the family members would glance toward the window, half expecting to see the mysterious figure Emma and Tyler had described. The silence of the mountain night seemed oppressive now rather than peaceful, filled with the potential for things that shouldn't be there. Morning brought fresh snow and brilliant sunshine, transforming the lodge's surroundings into a postcard-perfect winter scene. In the bright light of day, the previous night's incident seemed less threatening, easier to dismiss, as a case of teenage imagination amplified by an unfamiliar environment. The family enjoyed a hearty breakfast in the dining room, where they met some of the other guests who had remained at the lodge. An elderly couple from New York mentioned that they'd been coming to Pinebrook for 15 years, and while they loved the location, they admitted that the lodge had changed in recent years. "Different atmosphere," the man said quietly, glancing around to make sure the staff couldn't overhear. "Used to be such a cheerful place. Now there's this heaviness about it, especially at night. We never used to lock our room door, but lately—" He shrugged and left the sentence unfinished. His wife nodded in agreement. "We're actually checking out this afternoon, a day early. My arthritis has been acting up something fierce since we got here, and Harold's been having the strangest dreams." The couple's comments cast a shadow over the Morrisons' breakfast, but James was determined not to let second-hand anxiety ruin their vacation. They'd paid for a weekend at a mountain resort, and they were going to enjoy it regardless of mysterious figures in the night or ominous warnings from other guests. The skiing that morning was spectacular. The fresh powder was perfect, the runs were nearly empty, and even Emma and Tyler seemed to have forgotten their nighttime fright in the joy of carving turns down pristine slopes. For several hours, the Morrison family experienced exactly the kind of bonding and recreation they'd hoped for. It was during their lunch break at the Mid-Mountain Lodge that they learned more about Pinebrook's recent troubles. Carol struck up a conversation with one of the ski instructors, a local man in his 40s who'd worked at the resort for over a decade. "You folks staying up at the main lodge?" he asked, and when Carol nodded, his expression grew serious. "How long you planning to be here?" "Just through tomorrow," Carol replied. "Why do you ask?" The instructor glanced around, making sure they wouldn't be overheard. "Look, I don't want to scare you or anything, but you might want to consider heading home tonight. Things have been weird up there lately. Guests leaving in the middle of the night, staff quitting without notice. Management's trying to keep it quiet, but word gets around in a small community like this." Tyler leaned forward, suddenly interested. "What kind of weird things?" "Son, I don't really know the details and I'm not sure I'd want to, but I will say this. If you see anything strange, anything that doesn't feel right, don't ignore it. Trust your instincts and get out of there." The instructor's warning lingered in the family's minds as they finished their skiing and returned to the lodge that afternoon. The building that had seemed so welcoming the night before now felt different somehow, as if the very walls were holding secrets they weren't meant to know. During dinner, they noticed that several more guests had checked out, leaving the dining room even emptier than it had been the previous evening. The staff moved through their duties with a nervous efficiency that suggested they wanted to finish their work and leave as quickly as possible. Emma, who had always been sensitive to atmospheric changes, complained of a headache that grew worse as the evening progressed. Tyler became unusually quiet and withdrawn, spending most of dinner staring out the windows at the darkening slopes where he'd seen the mysterious figure. Carol and James discussed leaving early, but their practical sides rebelled against the idea. They'd already paid for the weekend, the skiing had been excellent, and they couldn't bring themselves to abandon their vacation because of vague warnings and teenage nightmares. That decision would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The second night began much like the first, with the family retiring early to their third-floor suite. But the atmosphere in the lodge felt different now, charged with a tension that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the building. The heating system made odd noises, the floorboards creaked without anyone walking on them, and the mountain wind sounded almost like voices whispering in languages they couldn't understand. Emma and Tyler were reluctant to sleep in their own room, asking if they could stay with their parents. James and Carol agreed, setting up makeshift beds in the sitting area where the whole family could stay together. The precaution proved wise because what happened that night was far worse than a simple sighting through a window. Around midnight, the temperature in their suite began to drop dramatically. Within minutes, their breath was visible in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows despite the lodge's heating system running at full capacity. Then came the sounds from the hallway outside their room. Footsteps, but not the normal sounds of guests or staff moving through the building. These footsteps were wet, leaving behind the squelching sound of soaked clothing and waterlogged boots on carpet. James crept to the door and peered through the peephole, but the hallway appeared empty. Yet the footsteps continued, pacing back and forth outside their suite, as if someone was standing guard or waiting for them to emerge. The family huddled together in the sitting area, listening to the impossible sounds and watching their breath form clouds in the Arctic air that had invaded their room. Emma was shivering uncontrollably, not just from cold but from a fear so profound it seemed to emanate from her very bones. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "something's trying to get in." As if responding to her words, the doorknob to their suite began to turn slowly. The deadbolt was engaged, but they could see the handle rotating as invisible hands tested the lock. When the door didn't open, something began pushing against it from the hallway, causing the heavy wood to flex and creak under supernatural pressure. Tyler grabbed his father's arm. "The window," he said, pointing toward the glass that looked out over the ski slopes. "Look at the window." They all turned to see what had captured his attention, and what they saw defied every rational explanation. The window was fogging up from the inside due to the temperature difference, but as they watched, writing began to appear in the condensation. Letters formed by invisible fingers, spelling out words in a script that seemed to flow like water. "Help us," the first message read, appearing and fading before being replaced by another. "So cold. Can't leave. Trapped here." The messages came faster now, overlapping and competing for space on the fogged glass. Names began to appear, dozens of them, written in the same flowing script that suggested they were being formed by fingers that had been submerged in water for far too long. Carol recognized some of the names from obituaries she'd read online while researching the lodge. Guests who had died at Pinebrook over the years, victims of skiing accidents, heart attacks and other tragedies that had befallen visitors to the remote mountain resort. But it was the final message that made her blood freeze. In letters larger and more urgent than the others, a single word appeared on the window: join. The pressure against the door intensified, and they could hear the deadbolt beginning to strain under the supernatural assault. Whatever was in the hallway was growing stronger, more determined, and the flimsy hotel lock wouldn't hold much longer. James made a decision that would save his family's lives. Instead of waiting to see what would happen when the door gave way, he grabbed the desk chair from the sitting area and smashed it against the window that faced the ski slopes. The safety glass spider-webbed but didn't break completely. James hit it again, then again, until finally a section gave way large enough for them to escape through. The drop from the third floor to the snow-covered ground below was dangerous, but not as dangerous as staying in the room with whatever was trying to break down their door. One by one, the family members lowered themselves from the window, first the children, then Carol, and finally James. They landed in deep snow that cushioned their fall, but soaked through their pajamas instantly, leaving them wet and freezing in the sub-zero mountain air. But they were alive and they were free of whatever supernatural forces had claimed the lodge. The family ran through the snow to their SUV in the parking lot, James fumbling with frozen fingers to start the engine while the rest of them huddled together for warmth. As the vehicle finally roared to life and they began driving down the mountain road, Carol looked back at the Pinebrook Lodge one final time. Every window in the building was glowing with an eerie blue light, and she could swear she saw figures moving behind the glass. Not the living staff or the few remaining guests, but something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in the lodge for new victims to join their eternal winter gathering. The Morrisons drove straight through the night, not stopping until they reached the safety of their own home in Boston. They never returned to collect their belongings from the lodge, and they never spoke publicly about what they'd experienced on that winter weekend. But James did some research in the weeks that followed, digging into the history of Pinebrook Lodge and the unusual number of deaths that had occurred there over the decades. What he discovered explained everything and nothing at the same time. The lodge had been built on the site of a previous structure that had burned down in 1923, trapping 17 guests and staff members in the flames. The victims had died during a blizzard that prevented rescue workers from reaching the mountain for 3 days, and their bodies had been exposed to sub-freezing temperatures for most of that time. When the new lodge was constructed 5 years later, the builders had incorporated some of the stone foundations and timber from the original building, essentially creating a memorial that contained physical remnants of the tragedy. Over the years, guests had reported unusual experiences, but the lodge's management had successfully kept most incidents quiet to protect their reputation. Cold spots in certain rooms, glimpses of figures in old-fashioned clothing, the sound of voices calling for help during winter storms. But in recent years, the supernatural activity had intensified dramatically. The spirits trapped in the lodge seemed to be growing stronger, more desperate, more willing to interact directly with the living. They were no longer content to simply haunt the building where they died. Now they wanted company, seeking to add new members to their collection of souls who would never leave the mountain. The Morrison family's escape had been narrow, and James realized that if they'd waited even a few minutes longer, they might have joined the ghostly residents of Pinebrook Lodge permanently. The resort closed permanently 6 months later, officially due to structural issues that made the building unsafe for guests. But locals knew the real reason. The lodge had become too dangerous, too active, with supernatural forces that no amount of renovation or exorcism could quiet. The building still stands empty on its mountain perch, slowly being reclaimed by the forest and the elements. But on winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the peaks, lights can sometimes be seen glowing in the abandoned windows. And if you know what to listen for, you can hear them calling across the mountain valleys. 17 voices from 1923, joined by others who had the misfortune to stay too long at a lodge where checkout time was a privilege reserved only for the living. The Morrison family learned that night that some places are hungry, that buildings can develop appetites for human souls, and that the most dangerous supernatural encounters aren't always the ones you seek out in remote cabins or isolated houses. Sometimes evil finds you in places that should be safe, in establishments that advertise comfort and relaxation, but deliver something far more sinister. The key to survival is recognizing the warning signs and having the courage to leave, even when leaving means abandoning everything you've invested in the experience. As James Morrison later told his children, no vacation is worth your life, and no amount of money spent is worth more than the safety of your family. The mountain lodge had offered them winter recreation, but what it really wanted was winter residents who would never see spring again. Now let me tend to our fire once more and prepare for our final tale of the evening. The flames are burning lower now, and I can feel the weight of these stories settling around us like a heavy blanket. The wind outside has grown stronger, reminding us how fortunate we are to be safe and warm inside these walls. Our last story comes from the most recent addition to my collection, an account that was shared with me just 3 months ago by a woman who still shakes when she tells it. This tale proves that supernatural encounters don't always happen in remote wilderness locations or historic buildings with tragic pasts. Sometimes the most terrifying experiences occur in places that seem perfectly ordinary, in structures so new and modern that the idea of them being haunted seems impossible. But as Sarah Chen discovered last summer, evil doesn't always need decades or centuries to establish itself in a location. Sometimes it can take root overnight, transforming a dream home into a nightmare that defies every rational explanation. Sarah was a successful architect from Seattle who had spent 2 years designing her perfect retreat, a contemporary cabin that would serve as both a creative workspace and a weekend escape from city life. The structure she created was a masterpiece of modern design, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that brought the surrounding forest inside while maintaining the comfort and functionality of a high-end residence. The cabin was built on a remote lot she'd purchased in the Cascade Mountains, surrounded by old-growth forest and accessible only by a private road that wound through several miles of pristine wilderness. Sarah had chosen the location specifically for its isolation, wanting a place where she could work on her architectural projects without the distractions and interruptions that plagued her city office. The construction process had taken 8 months, with Sarah overseeing every detail personally to ensure her vision was executed perfectly. She'd selected sustainable materials, incorporated state-of-the-art technology, and designed the layout to maximize both privacy and connection with the natural environment. When the cabin was finally completed in June, Sarah felt she'd created something truly special. The main living area featured soaring ceilings and walls of glass that provided panoramic views of the forest canopy. Her design studio occupied the 2nd floor, with north-facing windows that provided perfect natural light for her work. The master bedroom was a sanctuary of calm, with a private deck that looked out over a small meadow where deer came to graze at dawn and dusk. Everything about the cabin represented Sarah's professional expertise and personal taste. This wasn't some historic structure with mysterious origins or tragic history. This was her creation, built to her specifications on land she'd personally selected. If any place should have felt safe and familiar, it was this modern retreat that embodied her dreams and ambitions. Sarah spent her first weekend at the cabin in a state of pure contentment. She unpacked her belongings, arranged her furniture, and set up her studio with the specialized equipment she needed for her architectural work. Everything functioned perfectly, from the high-tech security system to the geothermal heating that kept the interior temperature precisely controlled. On Sunday evening, as she prepared to return to Seattle for the work week, Sarah stood on her deck, watching the sunset paint the forest in shades of gold and crimson. She felt a deep satisfaction in what she'd accomplished, creating a personal sanctuary that would serve as her creative haven for years to come. That sense of satisfaction wouldn't last long. Sarah returned to the cabin the following Friday, eager for another weekend of peace and productivity. But as she pulled into the circular driveway, she noticed something that made her pause. One of the large windows on the main floor appeared to have a crack running through it, a spiderweb of damage that definitely hadn't been there when she left. She parked and walked around the cabin, inspecting the exterior for signs of what might have caused the damage. There were no fallen branches nearby, no evidence of impact from birds or other wildlife. The crack seemed to have appeared from the inside, as if something had struck the glass from within the cabin. Sarah unlocked the front door and stepped inside, immediately noticing that the temperature was much colder than it should have been. The geothermal system was running, but the interior felt like a refrigerator despite the mild June weather outside. She checked the thermostat and found it set to the same comfortable temperature she'd programmed before leaving. The system was working properly, but somehow the cabin couldn't maintain the heat. It was as if something was actively draining warmth from the interior, creating an atmosphere that felt more like winter than early summer. The damaged window was even more puzzling when viewed from inside. The crack pattern radiated outward from a central point about 5 feet above the floor, exactly as if someone had punched the glass with tremendous force. But the security system showed no signs of intrusion, and there was no evidence that anyone had entered the cabin while she was away. Sarah spent Friday evening trying to rationalize the damage and the temperature problems. Maybe there was a flaw in the window installation that had caused stress fractures. Maybe the geothermal system had a circulation problem that her contractors would need to address. These were the kinds of issues that sometimes occurred with new construction, annoying but hardly supernatural. She made notes about the problems she'd need to report to her contractors, then settled in for what she hoped would be a relaxing weekend, despite the minor issues with her perfect retreat. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came on Saturday morning, when Sarah woke to find that every piece of furniture in the main living area had been moved, not dramatically rearranged, but shifted just enough to be noticeable to someone who knew the space intimately. The sofa was turned at a slight angle. The coffee table had been moved 6 inches to the left. The dining chairs were no longer perfectly aligned with the table. It was subtle, but unmistakable to the architect who had personally placed every item according to her precise vision. Sarah's security system showed no alerts, no evidence of anyone entering the cabin during the night. The doors were still locked from the inside, the windows secure and undisturbed, except for the crack she'd discovered the day before. She walked through the entire cabin, checking every room for signs of intrusion. Everything else appeared normal, though she couldn't shake the feeling that subtle changes had been made throughout the structure. Nothing dramatic enough to be certain, but enough small alterations to make her question her memory of how she'd arranged things. The temperature problem had worsened overnight. Despite the geothermal system running continuously, the cabin felt like a meat locker. Sarah could see her breath when she exhaled, and frost was beginning to form on the interior surfaces of the windows. She called the contractor who had installed the heating system, but it was Saturday and she got only a voicemail promising a callback on Monday. Sarah was left to spend the weekend in a cabin that felt more like a walk-in freezer than the comfortable retreat she'd designed. That evening, as she sat in her living room wearing a heavy sweater and trying to work on a project, Sarah heard the first of the sounds that would change everything. It started as a subtle creaking, like the sound of someone walking on the floor above her. But Sarah was intimately familiar with every sound her cabin should make, and this wasn't the normal settling of a new building. This was the distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving back and forth across the second-floor studio. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs to investigate, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. If someone had somehow bypassed her security system and was hiding in her studio, they were about to discover that she wasn't going to be intimidated in her own home. But when she reached the second floor, the studio was empty. Her drafting table, computer equipment, and architectural models were all exactly as she'd left them. There was no one there, no sign that anyone had been there, no explanation for the footsteps she'd clearly heard. As she stood in the empty studio, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her breath was visible in the frigid air, but more importantly, she could see footprints in the thin layer of dust that had accumulated on the floor since construction ended. The prints were bare feet, adult-sized, leading from the stairway to her drafting table and back again. They appeared fresh, as if someone had been walking through the studio just moments before her arrival, but there was no one there to have made them. Sarah followed the ghostly footprints with her flashlight beam, noting that they seemed to focus on her current project, a design for a luxury resort that she'd been working on for the past several months. The invisible visitor had spent time examining her drawings, standing at her drafting table in the exact position where she normally worked. The realization that something unseen was taking interest in her professional work added a new dimension of violation to the experience. This wasn't just a random haunting or residual energy. This was an intelligent presence that was studying her, learning about her, perhaps even judging her work. Sarah retreated to the main floor and spent the rest of the evening huddled by the fireplace, the only source of warmth that seemed to provide any comfort in the supernaturally cold cabin. Every few minutes, she would hear the footsteps resume overhead, always the same pattern, always ending at her drafting table. By morning, Sarah had made a decision. Whatever was happening in her cabin, she wasn't going to let it drive her away from the retreat she'd spent 2 years creating. This was her home, her sanctuary, her professional workspace. No ghost or supernatural presence was going to claim it without a fight. She spent Sunday researching the history of her property, trying to find some explanation for the paranormal activity, but the land records showed nothing unusual. The lot had been undeveloped forest for over a century, with no previous structures, no recorded deaths, no tragic events that might have left spiritual imprints. The research did reveal one interesting fact. Her property was located near what had once been a Native American settlement, abandoned sometime in the late 1800s when the tribe was forced to relocate to a reservation further inland. But the settlement had been several miles away, and there was no indication that her specific lot had ever been occupied or held any special significance. Still, Sarah wondered if her modern cabin had somehow disturbed spiritual energies that had lain dormant in the forest for generations. Maybe the construction process had awakened something that resented the intrusion of contemporary civilization into its ancient domain. Armed with this theory, Sarah decided to try a direct approach. That evening, she spoke aloud to whatever presence was sharing her cabin, acknowledging its existence and asking what it wanted. "I know you're here," she said, standing in the center of her living room. "I can hear you walking around upstairs, and I know you've been moving my furniture. I don't want to fight with you, but this is my home now. Can't we find a way to coexist peacefully?" The response was immediate and terrifying. Every piece of furniture in the room slid several inches toward her, as if invisible hands were pushing them from all sides. The temperature dropped so rapidly that ice began forming on the walls, and the sound of footsteps overhead became a thunderous pounding that shook the entire structure. Sarah ran for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The electronic lock had engaged, trapping her inside with whatever had been angered by her attempt at communication. The security system's control panel was flashing red, showing that all doors and windows were sealed in what appeared to be a lockdown mode she hadn't programmed. The pounding from upstairs grew louder, joined by the sound of her expensive equipment being thrown around the studio. Crashes and bangs echoed through the cabin as thousands of dollars worth of professional tools and computer hardware were destroyed by the invisible presence. Sarah pressed herself against the locked door, watching in horror as her perfect retreat transformed into a supernatural battleground. The lights flickered on and off, the temperature continued to plummet, and frost spread across every surface like a living thing seeking to freeze her alive. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The pounding ceased, the temperature began to return to normal, and the electronic locks disengaged with a soft click. Sarah could have left then, could have fled to her car and never returned. But something made her stay. Maybe it was professional pride in what she'd created, or maybe it was simple stubbornness. Whatever the reason, Sarah remained in her cabin and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next would haunt her for the rest of her life. Around midnight, Sarah heard a new sound from upstairs. Not footsteps this time, but what sounded like someone working at her drafting table. The scratch of pencil on paper, the rustle of blueprints being moved around, the quiet concentration of an architect deep in creative work. Driven by curiosity stronger than her fear, Sarah crept up the stairs to see what was happening in her studio. What she found there defied every law of physics and reason she understood. Her drafting table was active with invisible hands working on her current project. Pencils moved by themselves, drawing lines and making notations on her carefully prepared blueprints. The computer screen glowed with CAD programs running themselves, creating modifications to her resort design with a skill and precision that matched her own professional abilities. But the changes being made to her project weren't improvements. They were corruptions, transformations that turned her elegant resort design into something dark and menacing. Windows became narrow slits like prison bars. Open, welcoming spaces were divided into cramped, claustrophobic rooms. The beautiful lobby she'd designed was being redesigned as something that resembled a morgue more than a hospitality space. Sarah watched in fascination and horror as her work was systematically destroyed and rebuilt according to some twisted architectural vision that turned comfort into confinement, beauty into ugliness, welcome into warning. The invisible architect worked with inhuman speed and precision, completing modifications in minutes that should have taken her hours, but more disturbing than the speed was the obvious intelligence behind the changes. This wasn't random vandalism or supernatural chaos. This was the work of someone who understood architecture, who had strong opinions about design philosophy, and who was determined to impose their vision on her creation. As Sarah watched, words began appearing on her computer, began to appear on a blank sheet of paper beside her drafting table, written in the same confident hand that was redesigning her project. The message was addressed to her personally. Your architecture is weak. Software, you design buildings that welcome strangers, that open themselves to anyone who wishes to enter. This is dangerous. Buildings should protect, should hide, should keep the wrong people out. I will teach you to build properly. The message continued, but Sarah found herself unable to look away from what was happening to her resort design. The invisible architect was adding features that made no sense from an engineering standpoint, but created an overwhelming atmosphere of dread and confinement. Secret passages that led nowhere, windows that looked inward rather than out, doorways that narrowed as you approached them. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered to the presence working at her table. The pencil stopped moving for a moment, then began writing again on the message paper. "I was an architect once. Like you, I believed in beauty, in openness, in creating spaces where people could gather and feel safe. But I learned too late that some people should not be welcomed, some gatherings should not be permitted, some safety is an illusion that leads to destruction." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold that had been plaguing her cabin. The presence wasn't just haunting her home, it was trying to corrupt her professional work, to turn her from the kind of architect who created beautiful, welcoming spaces into someone who designed buildings that excluded and intimidated. "What happened to you?" she asked, genuinely curious despite her fear. The response came immediately. "I designed a community center in 1987. Open floor plans, walls of glass, multiple entrances. I was so proud of my work, of how it brought light and air into a space meant for public gathering. 43 people died there during a holiday celebration. The building I created made them sitting ducks when evil came calling. My beautiful open design became a killing field because I prioritized aesthetics over protection." Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the tragedy the ghost was describing. The Riverside Community Center massacre had been major news in the architectural world, a case study in how design decisions could have unintended consequences for public safety. The architect who had designed that building, Marcus Hendricks, had committed suicide 6 months after the shooting, unable to live with the guilt of feeling responsible for the deaths. "You're Marcus Hendricks," she said quietly. The pencil moved again. "I was. Now I'm something else. Something that understands what architecture should really be about. Not beauty, not openness, not bringing people together. Safety, protection, keeping the wrong people out before they can do harm." Sarah watched as her resort design continued to be transformed into something that resembled a fortress more than a vacation destination. Every modification was technically brilliant but philosophically corrupt, turning her vision of hospitality into a paranoid fantasy of defensive architecture. "Marcus, I understand your guilt, but this isn't the answer," Sarah said, addressing the ghost directly. "What happened at Riverside was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. You can't prevent evil by making beautiful spaces ugly, by turning architecture into a weapon of exclusion." The temperature in the studio dropped again, and the invisible presence's work became more aggressive. Lines were drawn with enough force to tear through the paper, and Sarah's computer screen flickered with increasingly disturbing modifications to her design. "You don't understand," the ghostly message continued. "You still believe architecture should serve people. But people are dangerous. People gather and plot and plan violence. Buildings should discourage gathering, should make people uncomfortable, should remind them constantly that they are not safe anywhere." Sarah realized she was witnessing the corruption of a brilliant mind, watching as guilt and trauma had twisted Marcus Hendricks' architectural vision into something that negated everything the profession stood for. His ghost wasn't just haunting her cabin, it was trying to recruit her into a philosophy that would turn her into the same kind of broken, paranoid designer he had become in death. "No," Sarah said firmly, moving toward her drafting table despite the supernatural cold that surrounded it. "Architecture is about creating spaces where people can live and work and gather safely. What happened at Riverside was the responsibility of the person who brought violence there, not yours. You can't solve evil with ugly buildings and paranoid design." She reached for her blueprints, intending to stop the ghostly modifications to her work. But as her hands touched the paper, she felt Marcus Hendricks' presence pour into her mind like ice water, bringing with it decades of guilt, rage, and twisted architectural philosophy. For a moment, Sarah saw the world through the dead architect's eyes. Every open space became a potential killing field. Every window became a vulnerability. Every welcoming entrance became an invitation to disaster. The paranoid vision was seductive in its completeness, offering the false comfort of control through defensive design, but Sarah's own vision was stronger. She thought of all the beautiful spaces she'd created, all the homes and offices and public buildings that had brought light and joy into people's lives. She thought of her cabin, designed to connect her with the natural world rather than hide from it. "I won't let you corrupt my work," she said, pulling her blueprints away from the ghostly presence. "And I won't let your guilt destroy what I've built here." Marcus Hendricks' response was immediate and violent. Every piece of equipment in the studio flew toward Sarah, missing her by inches as she ducked and rolled away from the drafting table. The computer monitors exploded in showers of sparks, and her expensive architectural models crumbled to dust as if aged decades in seconds. But Sarah's cabin held together. The structure she designed with love and care proved stronger than the ghost's rage, and gradually the supernatural assault subsided as Marcus Hendricks' energy was exhausted by his outburst. In the sudden quiet that followed, Sarah heard something that broke her heart, the sound of crying. Marcus Hendricks, brilliant architect turned vengeful ghost, was weeping with the grief of someone who had spent 35 years blaming himself for a tragedy that wasn't his fault. "I just wanted to create beautiful spaces," his voice whispered through the studio, no longer angry, but infinitely sad. I just wanted people to feel welcome and safe. Sarah felt tears running down her own cheeks as she recognized the man Marcus had been before guilt had twisted him into something destructive. "You did create beautiful spaces," she said gently. "I've seen photographs of your work from before Riverside. You made buildings that brought light and joy into people's lives. That's who you really are." "But they died," Marcus whispered. 43 people died in my beautiful open space. "And thousands of others lived better lives because of all the beautiful spaces you created," Sarah replied. "One terrible day doesn't erase a lifetime of bringing beauty into the world. You can't let the worst moment of your career define everything you accomplished." The studio grew warmer as Marcus's presence began to change, the rage and paranoia gradually giving way to the grief he'd been carrying for decades. Sarah's damaged blueprints began to restore themselves, the corrupted modifications fading as the ghost's twisted vision loosened its grip on her work. "I've been so angry for so long," Marcus said, his voice growing fainter as his connection to the physical world weakened. "So afraid that what I created would hurt people again." "Fear isn't the foundation for good architecture," Sarah said. "Love is. Love for beauty, love for the people who will use the spaces we create, love for the potential of human gathering and community. You knew that once. You can remember it again." As she spoke, Sarah felt Marcus Hendrix's presence beginning to dissipate, the guilt and rage that had bound him to the earth finally releasing their hold. The temperature in the studio returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued her cabin since Friday evening began to lift. "Thank you," Marcus whispered as his ghost faded away. "I had forgotten what it felt like to create something beautiful." Sarah stood alone in her damaged studio as the first light of dawn began to filter through the north-facing windows. Her equipment was destroyed, her project would need to be rebuilt from scratch, but her cabin felt like home again. Over the following weeks, as she repaired the damage and replaced her destroyed equipment, Sarah often thought about Marcus Hendrix and the lesson his haunting had taught her. Architecture was indeed about more than creating beautiful spaces. It was about maintaining the courage to keep creating them despite the risks, despite the possibility that human evil might corrupt even the most carefully designed environment. The resort project she eventually completed was even more beautiful than her original design, informed by her encounter with an architect who had let fear destroy his vision. She incorporated security features that would help protect guests without compromising the open, welcoming atmosphere that made the space special. Sarah's cabin in the Cascades remains her creative sanctuary, though she's never again experienced supernatural visitation. Sometimes, when she's working late in her restored studio, she feels a presence watching over her work, but it's not malevolent or corrupting. It's the grateful spirit of an architect who finally found peace by remembering that beauty, not fear, should guide the hands that shape the spaces where people live their lives. The lesson of Marcus Hendrix's ghost is clear. Guilt and trauma can corrupt even the most noble professions, turning creators into destroyers, builders into breakers. But redemption is always possible for those who remember their original purpose and find the courage to pursue it again, even after the worst failures and most devastating losses. Architecture, like all creative endeavors, requires the faith that human beings are worthy of beautiful spaces, that gathering and community are goods worth pursuing despite their risks, and that the proper response to evil is not paranoid defensiveness, but determined creation of environments that celebrate the best possibilities of human nature. As our evening together draws to a close and the last log settles into glowing embers in our fireplace, I hope these tales have reminded you that the supernatural world touches our lives in ways both terrifying and profound. The boundaries between the living and the dead are thinner than we imagine, and the places we choose for solitude and retreat often hold secrets that challenge everything we think we understand about reality. But perhaps more importantly, these stories demonstrate that even in our encounters with the impossible, with forces beyond our comprehension, we retain the power to choose how we respond. We can flee in terror, or we can stand our ground with compassion. We can let fear corrupt our vision, or we can maintain faith in the fundamental goodness that makes human life worth living. The cabin fires will continue to burn, the shadows will keep dancing on wooden walls, and somewhere in the wilderness, new stories are being written by those brave or foolish enough to seek solitude in places where they might not be alone. Until we meet again around these flickering flames, remember that every encounter with the unknown is an opportunity to discover not just what lies beyond the veil, but what lies within ourselves. Thank you for joining me tonight around our cabin fireplace, where the warmth of human companionship proves stronger than the cold of supernatural dread, and where sharing our fears somehow makes them less frightening. Sleep well, and may your own retreats bring you only the peace and solitude you seek. The wind outside our cabin has grown stronger now, rattling the windows and reminding us that winter nights in the mountains can be unforgiving. But here, by our fire, surrounded by the warmth of shared stories and the comfort of human connection, we find ourselves grateful for these walls that shelter us from both the elements and the unknown forces that might lurk in the darkness beyond. As I've shared these tales with you tonight, I've noticed something remarkable happening. The stories themselves seem to have created a protective barrier around us, a circle of understanding that acknowledges the reality of supernatural forces while affirming our ability to face them with courage and wisdom. Each account we've explored together has revealed not just the existence of the impossible, but the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with mysteries that defy explanation. The cabin where we've gathered tonight represents something profound about our relationship with solitude and the places we choose for refuge. Unlike the haunted locations in our stories, this sanctuary feels genuinely safe, blessed perhaps by the countless evenings when people have gathered here to share experiences, offer comfort, and find meaning in the face of life's uncertainties. But I want you to consider something as we prepare to part ways. Every single story we've shared began with someone making a choice to seek solitude, to step away from the familiar comfort of civilization and venture into spaces where the rules of ordinary existence might not apply. Sarah renting her mountain cabin, the college friends reuniting at Mirror Lake, Marcus seeking creative inspiration in the Minnesota wilderness, the Morrison family choosing a remote ski lodge, Jennifer confronting the desperate ghost of Thomas Brennan. What drove these people to seek isolation? Was it simply the desire for peace and quiet, or something deeper? I believe each of them was searching for an encounter with truth, seeking spaces where the distractions and noise of modern life couldn't interfere with their ability to connect with something essential about themselves and the world around them. The tragedy is that they found exactly what they were looking for, just not in the form they expected. Instead of peaceful self-discovery, they encountered forces that challenged their understanding of reality itself. But even in the midst of supernatural terror, each of these individuals discovered something valuable about their own capacity for courage, compassion, and determination. So there you have it, 5 tales from the fireplace that prove the wilderness holds more secrets than we could ever imagine. 5 stories that remind us that when we seek solitude in the most remote places on Earth, we might discover we're never truly alone. But more importantly, these accounts show us that even when faced with the impossible, with forces that defy everything we thought we knew about the world, the human spirit has an incredible capacity to respond with wisdom, courage, and compassion, rather than simply terror and flight. Thank you for spending this evening with me by the fire. If these stories have unsettled you, remember that sharing our fears in the warm company of others somehow makes them less frightening. And if you're planning your own retreat to some remote cabin in the woods, well, perhaps you'll pack a little extra courage along with your supplies. Until next time, may your fires burn bright and your solitude be truly peaceful.